Okay, so here now we're going to begin taking some approaches to restoration. How are we actually going to try to accomplish the things that we've begun to plan out in the first half of the lecture? In order to do this, obviously, there's a lot of background that goes into all this stuff. You need to know the history, not just the historical ecosystem that you've got, but how did that historical ecosystem come to be, right? We talked about succession before, right? And so understanding the successional processes that led to what your sort of historical model for restoration is going to be. How did that arrive, okay? And how do those processes work, right? So if you're going to try to build something, if you know how it actually happened in the real world, then you're an awful lot better off in terms of trying to put together a plan. Obviously, and this is something that becomes more important the larger scale in terms of map distance kind of scale, spatial scale. The larger that is, the more of these other kinds of concerns come in. What are all the species that you're working with? How do they interact with each other? How do they interact with the abiotics or the non-living parts? So the geology, the water, all of that kind of stuff, the weather, the climate. What is actually happening now, right? And also what were the processes then, okay? And because you're one little part of the world, you might only be restoring a couple of hectares, right? Somebody might come in and say, this wetland, my ancestors drained it, I want it turned back into a wetland, I'd like to have ducks and things living here, whatever, okay? That one little couple of hectares of wetland you're restoring might be kind of a key part of a much larger interconnected landscape, okay? And so you cannot consider just your little piece, you have to put it in this greater context out here. And as a result, most of the things that you'll do as a ecological restorationist, right, are going to be on that landscape, that big, broad, massive spatial scale kind of thing, even if the things that you actually do are on small scales, are on those couple of hectares, okay? You need to consider what the small scale things you're doing are going to do to the larger environment. So as you look at the animals here, which is really where a lot of clients are mostly concerned with things, because you're only working on that small scale, the reality of it is that most of the animals that you're working with are going to be transient within that smaller area. They're going to live their entire lives out interconnected with their other things, okay? And so you need to remember a couple of different important ideas here, a couple of population concepts, we'll call them. One of these we've talked about already and is mapped out over here in the picture. This is a meta-population, right? All of these subpopulations that are connected to one another, either as sources or as sinks, right? The other concept here is the concept of a deme, okay? And a deme is within a population, whether it's a meta-population, a subpopulation, just a regular asshole population, whatever. Within that population, the individuals that have a high possibility of interbreeding, okay? So a deme might include these guys, and these guys, right? But not necessarily these guys and these guys, okay? So it might be these three subpopulations, but not these four, okay? But a deme might also include this guy and this guy, right? So again, understanding what those demes are will help you kind of understand which parts of your meta-population network become really important for you. Other things to consider here, again, exotic or species that have been brought in intentionally, accidentally. Introduced species here is another way to think about it. They're a pain in the ass for many reasons. They tend to come in and take over and eradicate local wildlife. plants, animals, whatever. They tend to reduce diversity, okay? So they're a real problem, just in general. But specifically here for restoration, they're often the cause of a lot of the changes that have happened. And so they are the thing to fix, right? They usually have pretty profound negative effects on native species. You're really going to be hard pressed to find an introduced or an exotic species where they've come in and native species have flourished in their presence. It really just doesn't happen. That said, right, you'll find cases where exotics have brought in, and even if they've had negative consequences for the ecosystem as it was, right? So they've made drastic changes to how the ecosystem is put together. Even with that, they can have positive impacts on the ecosystem as it is now. So it's not impossible to imagine a scenario where things are good now, even in the presence of these introduced species. But they're going to be a problem, okay? And so as always, right, we think about making choices, okay? Everything has got a trade-off. So you got to pick, okay, given the time, the money, the sociological consequences of what I'm going to try to do, I can save these parts of it, and this part is just going to have to remain as it is, right? Always prioritizing is kind of the thing. And a big part of prioritizing is trying to assemble groups of species to manage for, or to, in this case, restore, right? It's a priority step. It's an important thing because, again, you can't do everything, right? You can't solve every problem. It's just not something you're going to be able to do. It's a little depressing, right? But it's the reality. And one thing that you can go to here are what are called assemblage rules. Basically, they're kind of guidelines for what a group of species, what kinds of things, what kinds of interactions need to be there, right? So, for example, you can't have only carnivores, right? You have to have carnivores and things for them to eat, right? Stuff like that. Other things to think about, right? You know, what are you managing for in terms of, are you managing for this to be a rare species? Are they managed to be a dominant species? Can you do that, right? Given the geology, given the climate, given sort of the other abiotic resources that are there. And again, so as you work up your groups of species, right? You need to be able to think, okay, well, what can I actually bring in, right? And what do they play nicely with? And I don't mean play nicely in the sense of, you know, can you put these two fish in a tank and they'll not kill each other? I mean, do they play nicely in the sense of all the resources for all of these species are there, even if that means that some of them are eating the other ones? So things that are going to go into that, right? Abiotic and biotic factors here, things we might think of as being filters that influence what the assemblage, I guess is the right word here to use, for the species that you're going to be able to get together. Climate, the geology, the structure of the landscape. Is it mountainous? Is it hilly? Is it a big open field? Are there big river valleys running through it? Is it near a glacier? Are you on the taiga? Whatever, okay? Is it continuous? Is it patchy? All of those things, right? Abiotic parts of this. Biotic parts, right, are species interactions, right? Things like competition, predation, okay? Mutualisms. Do two species work better in the presence of one another? Does one species require the presence of another one, right? We see this a lot with trees, for example. You might go in and say, okay, I'm going to restore this old forest to the way that it was. But what you're going to find is that you can plant all the trees of that species you want, but if they don't have, say, the right mycorrhizal interactions, sort of this symbiosis with a fungus, if they don't have that, they won't grow. They will all die, right? And so, you know, these mutualisms are not trivial things to think about. What have interactions with humans done, right? What kinds of disturbances are there? Is there a successional pattern to the species that are being brought in, right? Do you have to bring in certain species first to pave the way, right? So you might imagine that if you're restoring a forest, you might have to bring in so these colonizer species of plants that are going to come in and prepare the soil for the trees to come later, things like that. So in terms of different kinds of ecosystems, right, we're going to see that there are different chronological patterns to things, right? So if we think about, for example, here, and you can consider this almost kind of continuous, the succession of an open grassland to a forest, right? The dominant plant species here at the bottom will go from grasses to shrubs to fast-growing, sort of loosely assembled trees, pines and things like that, where we might have considered kind of an open canopy. There's lots of space, lots of light filters down to the ground, towards more of a hardwood closed canopy where the leaves block off a lot of the light and very little light actually gets to the ground. You walk through different kinds of forests and you can experience this for yourself. If you walk through a pine forest during the middle of the day, it's pretty bright, right? But if you walk through a oak stand in the middle of the day, it can be pretty dark in there. And that's what we mean here by open and closed canopy. And one of the challenges here with this kind of successional chronological pattern is that you see changes in the amount of what we call niche space. How many different ecological roles can be filled by animals within this ecosystem, right? And sometimes it's a sort of a continuous growth, right? As you go from grass to shrub, what we find is that there are more niches available because there's more structure, right? In a grassland, there's basically one level of structure, things that are on ground level. With a shrub kind of community, you have ground level, you have things living in the shrubs, you have things living on top of the shrubs. There's a lot more structure there. Plus, right, in the spaces between the shrubs, you still have all of that open grassland. So there's lots of potential niche space and lots of potential roles for animals to come in and fill. But as we go from, say, open canopy to closed canopy, we begin to lose some of that, right? And one of the reasons that we lose some of that niche space is that we lose light, right? If there's no light reaching the forest floor, very few plants can live like that, right? And so the forest floor becomes really more empty and barren, right? There's very little plant life that lives down there. It's mostly leaf litter. And so, again, you lose space for animals to occupy. Okay, and again, you can test this for yourself. If you walk through a pine stand, there's shrubs and grasses and things growing all over the place. If you walk through an oak stand, a relatively old oak stand, there's nothing growing on the ground, right? Because it's a closed canopy kind of a thing. So again, thinking about what is going to happen now, what has happened, what the chronological processes you're going to be implementing are, this all kind of has a big impact, right, on what your species assemblages are going to be. Okay, so you've got a plan, you figured out what your species are, how you're going to introduce them, all these things. What are some of the implications for what you're asking to do? Okay, and what are some of the implications for what you're doing? You can actively try to kind of alter some of these filters, right? You can't do much about climate. You can change landscape structure a little bit by choosing species to promote, by choosing species to get rid of. You can alter some of these biotic filters here. So you can try to actively do some of that stuff. And in doing so, right, you can provide structure, right? So again, we're thinking about going to a grassland and trying to turn it into a forest again, right? as you bring in shrubbery, bring in things like that, you're bringing in structures. Sometimes you have to make man-made structures. I saw a thing this morning where people are trying to restore woodchuck habitat by using mailboxes. Woodchucks like to kind of huddle in smaller spaces, about the size and shape of a mailbox. So they're bringing in mailboxes and putting them out for them to be artificial structure. In terms of the biotic stuff here, right? Again, this comes into trying to control invasive introduced exotic species, controlling predators, although as we've seen, predator control is usually not a very good idea, not a very effective idea anyway. And in some cases, trying to reintroduce species that used to live there but are now locally extinct. Okay. Obviously, one of the things that we need to think about here in terms of trying to restore things is what is the habitat, right? What is the habitat we're measuring? What is the habitat in terms of the greater spatial scale of the animals experiencing it? Okay. So we might think about thinking at larger landscape scales, sort of smaller individual scales. So like going from a landscape to say an individual meadow. Within that individual meadow, maybe an individual male or female's territory, right? The area around the individual itself, okay? In terms of your management goals, but you also need to understand that the animals themselves in each of these spatial scales, different important things go into that, right? So we might think about the entire meadow as how many animals are there, right? What's the abundance of them there? Their individual territories have relationships to breeding success. Okay, can they defend a territory? Are there enough territories for all the individuals? That kind of stuff. And then at the individual scale, are they there next year? Right? Are they there in 2 years? Right? How do we make those things work? One of the issues that we've got when we focus on habitat exclusively, though, is that while the things that we're measuring might stay the same, a meadow might be this same year in and year out, okay, but animals might choose to use them differently, right? And one of the things that happens when we see changes in habitat use through time is not that the animals themselves are really changing a whole lot, it's that something that we didn't catch is changing, okay? There might be a resource that we don't recognize or that we don't think is important, that within that meadow, although it appears to be identical year in and year out, something important is changing in that we're not measuring or we're not seeing, okay? And those things that we're missing is what's underlying use and changes to use within that habitat. And so if we're going to try to restore something, we have to think about everything, right? The more of these what we call niche factors that are changing that we're not measuring, the less successful we're going to be ultimately. Okay, so beginning to close things out. What are our desired conditions, right? How do we come up with our desired conditions? Okay, understanding the historical metric that we're trying to get back to, right? We need to find various data sources from this. So these might be museum records, right? A lot of these little small towns here in the eastern part of the United States and even into the Midwest have small local historical societies or local museums where people have kept records of stuff, right? Now this might only go back to European colonization, so they might be 1700s or maybe a little bit earlier, most likely 1800s and more recent. But sometimes that's enough, right? If we're going way back in time, we're trying to go pre-colonization, pre-human interaction, all that kind of stuff, we can use fossil records. We can use, if we're looking for pre-colonial records, we can use a lot of Native American resources, so things like middens or trash heaps can tell us a little bit about what kinds of animals and plants were available at the time. As an archaeologist, you would spend a lot of time going through garbage dumps, latrines, things like that to find this kind of information. You can look at available literature, so the scientific literature, not like somebody's blog, right? But scientific literature might have some information on this kind of stuff. But you always need to kind of understand that the farther back in time you go, the less certain you are. The less like things are now, the less likely smaller niche observations were to have been made, the less likely that an observation is to be correct. Okay, so lots of different things to kind of tie into that. Ultimately, though, you'll use those historical assessments to come up with a set of desired conditions, right? You'll build a conceptual model of how you envision the ecosystem to work post-restoration, and you'll do so primarily by focusing on usually just a handful of what we'll call focal species, things that if you manage for them, everything else will kind of fall into place around them. Implementing this stuff, right? 3 big steps in this. You've got a planning area, right, which is going to be the landscape scale kinds of things. What is all of the interactions with all these things with your handful of little hectares that you'll be working on, which is the project area. And then once you've identified these 2 areas, then you'll actually go in and do it, right? The implementation of your adaptive management. Year in and year out. Again, this is not going to be a 1-year thing, right? It's going to be a multi-year process. And so you go through year by year by year, have yearly goals, see how you're meeting them. If you're not meeting them, what do you need to do? What do you need to do to change? As you plan this stuff out, right, one of the big things that you need to consider is what is the landscape, what is the habitat, and what do they look like, right? So is there a lot of heterogeneity in there? Is there a lot of patchiness, right? Is that your goal, right? We think about patchiness as being bad, usually because when we think about patchiness, it's because it's something we've done. But historically, landscapes were patchy, right? And that might be a goal that we're looking for, right? It might not be, right? We want something that's homogeneous instead, but we need to understand what it is now, okay? And so from there, right, we can think about what has happened, right? Are we fully fragmented, right? Like we see here in case B. Can we put in corridors linking these fragmented little chunks, right? Is that going to be sufficient, okay? Or do we need to restore the entire area? Can we not get by with a corridor? Do we have to make this entire interleaved area more like what our core habitats are? So as we do so, right, ultimately here, this is all going to be guided by a handful of different sets of guidelines. What are our goals? What are our guidelines for species richness, for biodiversity? Okay, what are we looking at overall for the entire work area, the entire planning area? What are we shooting for? What are we looking for if we're looking for patches, okay, within that overall environment? What are we trying to accomplish within each of those patches, and how are we going to maintain it? Okay, and then finally, how are we going to maintain habitat patches at our desired occupancy rate? We don't want to have species coming in and completely overwhelming it and stripping the patch bare and making it no longer usable. We don't want them abandoned. We want them to be somewhere around K, right? And our K is going to be dependent on kind of our own individual wants and needs on this one. Okay? All right, so to close it out, wildlife ecology, restoration ecology, each one is linked to the other, okay? As you plan for restoration, you need to understand what's there, what you want to have there, and how are they going to react to the things that you're trying to do. You have to think not only about the animals and plants, but also what's the geology, what's the water like, what's the topography like, because those things are going to limit what you can actually do. Okay, if you've got a mountain that was strip mined, you can't restore that, right? Unless you want to build a new mountain. So that's going to be something that's going to limit what you can do. You also need to understand that while you're managing one small little area, right, a couple of hectares, it's not isolated. It's a part of a larger landscape. And so the things that you do are going to affect that larger landscape. And also your success at managing that smaller area is going to be affected by what the larger landscape is. Usually what we're talking about when we talk about restoration, it's to fix things that we've done. And so you need to understand and have a way of describing the things that we have done and what the effects of those things that we did are. And also what is out of our control and out of our fault, okay? Because you remember that it comes back to politics, and you're going to be talking to politicians, which means you're going to be talking to people who are stupid. Let's just be perfectly honest. And so you need to have a way of explaining this in a way that even a really, really dumb person who probably doesn't want to hear you talk to them can understand why it's important. Because if you can't do that, you're not going to get the money to do what you want to do. Okay? All right. So that's good for now. Let's go ahead and close this out. And in the next chapter, we'll talk about, again, something else that will be kind of taking our first steps into these larger